Hello. Just stand back here. Hi. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Blaget. Thank you for joining us for this conversation here at SARA'S. It's my pleasure to introduce artists Harris Rosenblum, Filip Kostic, Genevieve Goffman, and our wonderful moderator, Almog Cohen-Kashi. Thanks again for being here. And now I'll hand it over to Almog, who will say a few more words about everyone and get the talk started.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for being here today on such a really nice day. My name is Almog Cohen-Kashi. I'm a writer and PhD student at Stony Brook University, where I focus on computational media and questions of materiality in modern and contemporary sculpture. I'm so happy to be here moderating this talk between Harris Rosenblum, Genevieve Goffman, and Filip Kostic on the occasion of Harris's exhibition, Inorganic Demons. Harris is a sculptor and researcher based in Belmont, Massachusetts. Aside from his current show, he also recently had solo exhibitions at Blade Study and CVA Gallery in Kent, Ohio. He received his MFA at Kent State in 2022. In addition to his practice, he is also a fabrication tech at Harvard School of Art and Design. Genevieve is a New York-based artist who got her MFA at Yale in 2022. Her work is included in the group exhibition Imagine, a journey into the new virtual at the Museum of Applied Art in Vienna, which opened this week. Recent solo gallery exhibitions include Before It All Went Wrong at Hyacinth Gallery. And Filip is an artist and teaches at the Art Center College of Design. He lives and works in LA and has worked in a group show that opened yesterday at Spy Projects. He has also been included in group shows at Public Works and Castle Center for Contemporary Art in Poland. Okay, so to start this talk, I wanted to position this idea of what content creation versus content collapse means to you, pointing to how the three of you combine your work with what exists online, bringing forward these questions of authorship, particularly through your collective use of characters throughout your work. Harris, you work with the image of pre-made characters in the same vein as an appropriation artist, using content from the medieval era juxtaposed with the contemporary moment. Genevieve, you make characters that enact labor in the sets you create to tell a narrative. And Filip, you place yourself in the center of your works. And I'm thinking specifically of your piece, Filip Kostic versus Filip Kostic, where you become a playable character with a mission. So, where Genevieve creates a character, and Harris, you create the character. You use the character. And Filip, you become the character. I want to ask the three of you if you could speak more on how you choose to collapse this content in the production of your work and how it serves as a material that, in many cases, is specifically ephemeral digital material.
I think, well, first, just as a quick primer, content collapse is a term that I borrow from Flip. So if you wouldn't mind just explaining kind of like what your conceptualization of that is.
Sure, yeah. I think I bastardized a term that Alexander Domanovic came up with called turbo sculpture, which is like a term coined around a specific movement of sculpture in the Balkans in the 90s. But the way that I thought about it was through the video game Fortnite, which allows for every intellectual property to exist within the same exact space at the same time. So a way to think about it is I can be playing as Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty, running through this sort of Pixar environment, swinging with a Spider-Man glove, running away from Thanos while trying to shoot down another character dressed up as a K-pop star. And all of these things have their own sort of contextual meaning and lore that are tied to themselves, that are incredibly important and vibrant, and most players understand that lore, but they also all sort of collapse in their meaning within the space of Fortnite, so they become meaningless. They sort of become visual signifiers, and that is happening at the same time that you're trying to play a competitive video game. And I don't think of Fortnite as the be-all, end-all of it, but I do see it as a symptom of that content collapse, I guess.
Yeah. I guess in my work, the thing I'm interested in with the content collapse is it feels like looking at these sort of hierarchical hegemonic structures that have this top-down approach, it's really hard to make meaning or content that feels like it actually resonates with the current moment. So this idea of content collapse allows us to sort of do this thing that's a collage of context and meaning that goes beyond appropriation in this era after sort of like everything is accessible and IP is sort of like obliterated.
I think, when I first heard you guys use this term content collapse, when we were first talking about having this conversation, I was like, was this like moment of, well, extreme gratitude actually, and I think a lot of artists would relate to that because it is a phrase that to me was so helpful even in understanding my own practice, where I am pulling like very heavily from internetified aesthetics, but also I pull a lot from history and mythology. And when, Almog references me creating characters, one artist I think of a lot who does this is the painter Emma Stern, and she talks about sort of like making up these girls that like play out these stories in her paintings. And so for me, the content collapse is pulling from these internet aesthetics, but also collapsing into that fragmented moments of history and the way sort of history itself gets kind of collapsed into our understanding of culture, as well as looking at repetitive storytelling. So in things like fantasy novels, in even like literature today, archetypal fictional tropes have taken on a certain meaning. If a character does one thing, it's tapping into this archetype. And in my use of sort of character creation or narrative, I'm collapsing kind of like the content and the storytelling content, the romantic content, into this character, which then is being displayed with these sort of aesthetics that I have like stolen from the internet, in a way where I both get kind of, to me it's very important to find like romance in my own art, I think. And it's this way of like bringing in the visual romance and collapsing that with sort of the narrative romance of storytelling.
Yeah, I think that like when I'm like thinking about like the Fortnite example as like a sort of like dark version of it, and I don't think of it entirely that way. I think that there's like a lot of opportunity within it. When I first spoke about that idea with a friend, he was like, "Oh, you're just talking about collage, essentially." And there is, I think, like a sort of lineage to like from collage towards like what Fortnite is doing. But I thought when I realized that, I guess it was somewhat freeing to me as like a way to be like, oh, okay, like if one of the largest IPs, one of the largest like franchises in the world that's owned by like the biggest video game conglomerate on the planet is able to like tell narrative by like putting a bunch of different narratives together and like not really worry about it, like it's kind of up in the air for everybody to do that by themselves as well. Like it became this sort of like permission that sometimes I think as like an artist, like I feel like I need to like just put whatever the hell next to whatever the hell and see what happens. And it allowed for like pop culture to sort of like open up in my mind a little bit more. But there is definitely a dark component of it, of like it's like this ultimate form of capital. Like let's just throw all of the biggest things together into one space and like see how it feels and how much we can like incentivize like buying specific loot boxes or something.
I have a obvious like relation of this idea of content collapse to like the Catholic Church and the medieval Catholic Church, where you had like essentially this feeling of alienation from like these larger capital structures or power structures. And then you have people inventing like their own lore of Christ or whatever. You have like Our Lady of Lucero's like house that transmutates from Jerusalem to like Lucero, Italy, to have like it's done in like Italian style architecture of like the era. Like there's not like it's obviously not true, but there's this like collective belief in this lore or this collective identification with, now it exists as content, and it has this sort of spiritual potential. Like if we see all of these narratives or I guess fandoms or whatever as these things that truly can act as a clarification of like the absolute, when we're doing it now, we're creating this narrative that we can have together, even if the physics of everything doesn't quite make sense. There's a little bit of space for magic, which is like, it's an exciting moment to be making art in, because we've been in this era for so long where the magic couldn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I really appreciate you bring that up. So I feel like to me, I think one of my like sort of foundations in art is my mom is an art historian. She works with like the Renaissance in Florence, specifically with Catholic art, and so that was sort of my early introduction to art. And from that, like their version of storytelling is almost like there is a content collapse in that, where what they are depicting very specific narratives from the Bible, but they're pulling in content from Florentine Italy in that time period, and they're pulling in each symbol represents something that they pull in represents something in their time that's sort of being collapsed into these frescoes and into these paintings that exist. And I think it's interesting because even in that moment, there was sort of a darkness to that, where it is like, there was a politics being pushed in each separate part of the church being made. There was a politics being pushed there, but at the same time is a way for, these artists to kind of express themselves and create these like monumental works that we still like look at today. So I think there's always, I think it's also very important always not to think of this as like an exceptional time. Like, we don't live in such a special time that it's exceptional. There are like roots in history that we've like touched before, but I do think there is also the idea of like quantity that we're touching right now that is like in and of itself almost a darkness in terms of like, or there's something sort of terrifying in terms of how much we have at our fingertips, that I think this kind of content collapse allows us both to contend with that quantity but also kind of have to face it.
Yeah, there's always been Easter eggs. It's just like now it's harder to find them.
So I actually wanted to move our conversation forward from that into like the materials that you use in the screen and kind of how you're working with death materials. So kind of thinking of the origin of the screen, or with 3D printing, how resin is toxic. So how does that manifest in your work, and how does that become a character in and of itself?
Yeah, so I mean, with this show in particular, a lot of the inspiration was this book by Reza Negrestani, Cyclonopedia, which, for those that don't know, it's this idea where oil is this substance by which the Middle East becomes this conscious entity that has this sort of insidious accelerating power on capital to bring itself down. So like this drive for infinite production is the thing that winds up killing it. So I guess what I'm interested in the toxic materials, it's kind of, I mean, I'm interested in like military technologies. Like, these are not new techs. These are things that have existed from like the 80s, and it's all been used for like military prototyping. Like, you look at like ARPANET as like the original way that computers were made. CAD was like originally made to like design things for like defense contracting. So it was something that like I haven't thought of as much until like starting to make this cycle of work. Yeah, but yeah, and it's also like it has that sort of accelerating power. Like, everything in the show is petroleum, pretty much. It's just like whether the petroleum has like eaten itself several times and like turned into a plant through like industrial agriculture, or if it's just like straight out of the ground.
I think when I think about that, I think one thing is like time itself being kind of this toxicity that comes up for me in my work, and I think there's a similarity there where I think one thing I come back to a lot in my work is radiation and like uranium. And one of the reasons that substance to me is like specifically fascinating is sort of it is poisonous over a given length of time, and the idea of poison being sort of measured by time. And so a lot of my work, which a lot of it is portraying the past, like not making fun of it, sort of scrutinizing the presentation of the past as a utopia and scrutinizing the presentation of the future as a utopia, and in it being like the toxicity itself is the perception of time and the perception of progress and technology as like a utopian tool, and progress itself as being something that's perceived as sort of positive when it can be incredibly toxic. But even in that sentence that I'm saying, there's a toxicity to being like, oh, well, in the past, we didn't have these things and therefore it's better. So either way you look at it, you're kind of trapped in this cycle of poison.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think, because like materially, I work with game engines, which have their own sort of like toxic politic, I guess, within them. But I guess when I think about like toxicity, I think about the conversation that you and I had earlier, which was that like I made this project in which I turned my bed into a computer, and then I worked out of my bed at the same time that I like did everything else that you would do. And part of the project to me was this like hope. Like I kind of saw, I didn't see the project as being dark in any way when I did it. I was like, this is the sickest thing I can do. I'm making my bed into a computer. Like finally, like childhood dream come true. And then like 5 months into the pandemic, working within the bed computer, and I was doing like live streams and stuff like that. Like it like started to sink in, like the darkness of it, which to everybody around me was incredibly obvious. I just didn't like put two and two together. And it's like I'm trying to like relate that to this sort of like relationship to the screen that I have. Like I very much want to like embed myself in monitors at times, and at times I'm like, that's incredibly dark in its own right. And I guess the relationship maybe to like labor, or like the blurring between like labor and like free time, or like labor and pleasure, is like this sort of like toxicity that necessitates itself, that I guess the work deals with, and I don't like fully understand how it, like what I'm doing when I'm doing that, because it feels like somewhat natural. So there's I guess like a sort of cultural sort of like self like L that I'm taking, in which I believe the thing is really amazing and cool, but like it like perpetuates itself in this dark way.
I mean, yeah, it's a thing too where it's like, I mean, there's a lot of shit in the world that sucks, and so like in order to make something really beautiful out of like kind of a decrepit like late stage capital environment where like everybody's alienated or whatever, you have to believe you can create this beautiful thing out of these like nasty materials. Because if you can't, like, I don't know, I guess we were all talking a little bit earlier about like that movie Crimes of the Future, and you can either see like becoming the Viggo Mortensen character who can like eat the plastic and finally feels comfort as like a beautiful thing, or you can see it as a terrifying thing. And I guess like it's not really up to us to decide what that winds up being. It's just like we can create the context where Viggo Mortensen eats the plastic, you know?
I think there's like something to be said for like creating something beautiful when you know that it's horrible. And I think there's also something sort of like being almost like if you as an artist can create this beautiful thing that within its context holds sort of makes its own poison apparent in doing so. I think that's like very powerful. I think there's like, you know, a poetry to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think about like this working with like technology and making artworks. I think inherently has this sort of like, I guess it doesn't have to have it inherently now that I'm saying it out loud, but the thing I was going to say is that it inherently has a sort of transgressive gesture to it if it has any self-awareness in its inception, that like in some way like is sort of speaking to that thing, which is like making the toxic nature of itself sort of present in like the actual like formal qualities or the like conceptual qualities of the project. Like I'm thinking about like as we sit in this room with like all of these petroleum artworks that are all beautiful, like absolutely gorgeous artworks, and like, I mean, the way that light passes through it and everything. It's like all these things that can sort of exist simultaneously while also addressing the fact that like that thing is filled with vape juice, and like, there's like, yeah, I guess that like the mashing together of these things becomes like quite transgressive to me and beautiful. Yeah.
So that's actually a great segue into thinking about the next question that I have for you, which is considering the debates between virtual and simulated space. What are the world images built for us that aren't necessarily real or unreal? In what ways can virtual space compensate for physical space?
Well, I'm a Hegelian idealist, so everything is real. But I think it's kind of a funny way of saying it, but like I think in reality, like the virtual space is where a lot of us hang out. Like I know it's where all of us met. It winds up, I guess, compensating for it, but it's really just this like world of minds, I feel like. And so this virtual space enables us to have the things that the material world like can't afford us, either through like physical limitations of like, I want something to float and I don't know how to do it in reality, or like the social limitations of like politics, where just like, I want to like make something out of hardwood, but like I can't afford hardwood. So I guess like the virtual space allows for this sort of like fluidity where like you can kind of do whatever you want. There are obviously still limitations in that because it is still real. It's like it is limited by like, I don't have like a beefed up, I don't have the bed PC. So like I can't like blast through and like create the thing as real as I want sometimes, but it definitely makes that space a little bit smoother.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like sometimes it's hard for me to distinguish the two because of the way in which I work and the amount of time that I spent with a screen. I think I'd like spend probably like 9 to 10 hours a day in some capacity looking at a screen, whether at like my desk or at my phone. And oftentimes when I'm like thinking about the perceived difference between like the virtual and the physical, I like think about like the absolute joy that one must feel at a Hatsune Miku concert, looking at like a projected hologram of like a Vocaloid that is like singing lyrics made by the like collective sort of voice of its fans, and how like that it complicates the sort of distinction between the two. Like that is a person having like a euphoric moment with a digital entity that like you can't separate the two, or like receiving like a shitty text message that makes you sad, or I don't know, like the hundreds of thousands of I don't know how many hours I spent on the internet, the amount of people that like fall in love in video games. It's like, how do you, or like to what end is it worth spreading the two away from each other at this point? And maybe it's to just have a debate about it, I guess, which I don't know how productive that ends up actually being. I feel like there's much more productive things to be done within like the acceptance, or like, I don't even know if it's an acceptance, just like, to me, it just feels like fact, like virtual and physical do not have any distinction from each other. We have like giant servers that are physical that like run on like a ton of like petroleum that produce virtual spaces. There's like no difference in the two spots, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's funny because both of you brought up the way that it's sort of like a space of like real interaction, and therefore the virtual is real because real interactions are happening there. And I spend a ton of time on the internet and as well, and I'm always in front of a computer screen. I think I have a sort of strange relationship to it where I never, in some ways, you know, obviously like I do communicate with my friends over text message, over Twitter, over, you know, like DM and stuff like that, but I've never really, my relationship to the virtual maybe is a little different in that when I do the building of worlds or like these sort of making like connections, emotional connections, it's usually like in various programs I use to connect art, where I create very like these characters and these stories I get very invested in, and I create sort of societies or imaginary versions of the world, and I let them play out, usually to horrible, tragic ends. And that to me is not, they are unreal worlds, but it's everything I'm doing there has a sort of like, I'm only drawing from pre-existing histories, and I'm always drawing from something that's like sort of existed, and then I'm imagining it to its like fullest extent. And the virtual gives me the ability to sort of like go in sort of like high octane hyper speed, like the most as far ahead as I can go with the sort of with the aesthetics that I've already been given, and sort of play that out. So someone's idea of paradise, my own idea of paradise, I can sort of build that up into this like beautiful, amazing world, and in doing so, I can display all the flaws inside of it. You know, you mentioned my show at Hyacinth Gallery before called Before It All Went Wrong, and in it I sort of build these pastoral Greco-Roman paradise, like mini pastoral Greco-Roman paradises that I love and I wish I could live in it, but as they're being built, like the sort of folly of them is like self-apparent, and the virtual world allows me to create these characters and these structures that are see-through, that are transparent, and they are transparent because in the virtual world there is, on the other side, you can see their own fakeness, and at a certain point they're going to disappear.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Genevieve, you work in this like really important part of the virtual space that isn't often talked about, but like the private server is like dramatically expands like the internal world that's possible, which is like, I think the ability for us to create our own worlds online and like intensify the alienation from like consensus is something that also is able to like drive your work, particularly to these like powerful conclusions where like not only is there a world that's presented, there's a world that you can actually have investment in, and like because of your own personal investment in like the private server or like the laptop screen that you're like organizing this narrative around, it allows you to have like a whole world that either like really resonates, but there's this, I guess, this dark possible side that I don't see in your work, but like the world where it doesn't resonate, where you can play with these like mental states that like can't relate to other people. So you get these like micro cultures of people who then, because they've been in this private server for so long, are creating this world in these like spaces that like maybe there's like 5 people on. It's like a subreddit with 2 users, forming like a whole new metaphysics. That leads to like maybe a weird thing, which has real effects in the real world. Like when you have that sort of alienation, it like changes reality.
That's like if you can find the subreddit with 2 users, that's like the holy grail.
You found like all of, the next few shows, yeah.
I think there's this question of like, can there be like anger without consequence? And I mean, like a lot of artists I know, and myself included, there's like a little bit, it's hard to make art without rage in it, or it's hard to make art without a little bit of anger in it. And I think online, for a moment, there was this idea that there was a place where we could express certain things without there being like real world consequences, which is just obviously not true. And I think, even in making my own art, which is a closed circuit, and often I don't even make my art really in the context of the online, though it is in the context of the virtual. Like it's not like I can see in myself that like, I think, maybe I think I'm secretly putting anger in the piece, but it comes out. And I think that's something that kind of like the virtual, one of the reasons that they're not that separate is because it's not like your emotions are going to be hidden. They're not going to be secret. They're going to be transparent.
So with how you're using all these technologies, you're making this PC bed, you're on these subreddit forums, you're all really working with work that really working with technology that really explicitly places you in the now, in this sort of hyper-contemporary sphere of working. So what does that really mean to you? And then following that line of thought, how do we define what constitutes an art object or image, and how has that shifted over time?
I mean, I don't think any of these technologies are of the now. I think they're just accelerated, honestly. I mean, like, maybe like laser cutting being like commercially available is like probably the closest thing to a tech that I use that's, I guess, like of the now. But like, really, I'm dealing with content more than like, or like things that I find, which I guess, I don't know, maybe there's like a specific organization of society that is of the now, but I don't know if I see an end to it. Like I see this world possibly extending into the future, or even like reaching back in history and like recontextualizing the past into like a similar sort of organizational structure. I think with respect to like the art object thing, I don't really know. I don't know what makes it an art object. It's just like a contextualization in this space.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly in the like using computers in an artwork and a sculpture might feel like, I guess it just feels like an honest sort of way to work. in that like I don't think about it that much. It's just like, oh, like I want to make a sculpture, and I love computers and think they have a rich sort of sculptural aesthetic and history, and like obviously I want to like do the things that I love to do, so you just do them. I guess like game engines have this like slick sort of like outer shell. They feel very, very new. I think it's just because they're becoming more and more ubiquitous within like artist practice, and it becoming a lot easier to use. But similarly have been around since like the early 90s. The one that I use, Unreal Engine, came out in like 2000 something. I don't remember when. I didn't use it back then. But there's a I agree with you when you say that like it feels maybe the actual sort of thing that feels to me like contemporarily relevant is like the content with which like I guess we all work with, which like I'm forced to respond to the current moment and that like I live in it, and if I don't, I feel somewhat irresponsible as an artist. So the current moment to me sort of folds into itself all of these things that we've been talking about, and one of those things is technology and the way that we're all using it. I just started 3D printing, and it's been around for like a long time. Yeah, I mean, yeah, a really long time. And as far as like what constitutes the art object, I have no earthly idea. I make video games sometimes, and I think about them as artworks, and when I'm making them, I also think about them as video games. And I think that like sometimes I'm like doing myself a disservice by being like, this is an artwork or something like that, because it's like, for what? Like, who am I doing that for? Other than like to like make myself feel better about going to art school, maybe. But I think that like that feels somewhat like relatively fresh, although some might disagree. This idea that like, I don't know, as a person that went to art school that contextualizes themselves as an artist and thinks of themselves as an artist, like you don't always have to make artworks. You can just make things and like that are discursive, hopefully, and like people can resonate with them. So like not to say that I'm like irreverent towards art as a contextualizing tool. I love art history and love art and love spaces like this that show art. I guess then putting them in spaces like this makes them artworks, I suppose, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, like, actually, what makes something an artwork is someone saying it's an artwork, and this is like not. I feel like that's such a loaded statement, and it's obnoxious. But I don't like. It's not a big deal. Like, and I think that's. And I think it's like saying something in art is a piece of art is not a big deal, and that is what makes it a piece of art. Whether or not it's good is kind of that's like your job as a person making the art is to make it good. I am also not here to like decide in this. If you were to show me, I could like point at something and be like, that's good or that's not. But that's my own opinion. But like, I do think that now we are in a place where art is presented. Something is presented to us as art. It's not really that interesting to point at it or and be like, that's art or that's not. Like, it's not. I don't see that as a constructive conversation. But maybe, I mean, like something that's like scary for me to admit. The reason I use like these technologies that I use, like 3D printing, is because I don't have the technical skill in my hands to make something out of clay. I don't have the ability to do that. That's not something that I could do. I'm not that proficient in you know, I can barely draw a straight line. Like I don't, you know, and I think that's, you know, why I use this technology for one part of it, but also because it allows me to pull so much content from the virtual, which is shaping our reality. I think outside of that, I see myself as an incredibly traditional artist. Like I make narrative and historic tableaus. Like I make, all of my art is incredibly figurative. It's referential of like, you know, the canon of like sort of art history, like in the 16th and 1700s. It's referential of architecture. Like it is very almost aesthetically conservative, other than it's all about cat girls. Like that I think is the only, this is when it like sort of departs into this like other space. And so to me, I think like there is this, the tools are sort of now adjacent, but I see it as, for me, it's an art object because I'm putting it in front of you and saying, this is a piece of art, and it's good because I'm a good artist.
Oh yeah, I do think that there's sometimes I guess it is productive to have the like, is it art conversation, but I'm thinking about this documentary that I rewatched about the running fence, the Christo Jean-Claude work, in which they installed a big fabric fence across like a large swath of land that went through people's backyards, that were like large, like 20-acre yards. Anyways, there was a big there's a moment in the film in which they're like in a court case in which people are talking about whether or not they can use the land, and in court people are sort of fighting with one another about what art is and isn't, and this is just like people that live in the town getting to decide like whether this running fence is an artwork or not. And a lot of people are like, you're just hanging a piece of cloth across my land, like that's not art. And then this woman comes up and she's like, oh, I like slave over a meal every day. I spend so much time making this thing, and I like put so much love and effort into it, and then you guys eat it and you enjoy it, and that's it. And to me, that's my artwork, and it just disappears. And that was like one of those moments where I was like, oh, that's actually like a productive conversation to be having about like what is an artwork and what isn't an artwork, by people who are don't like traditionally consider themselves artists, and like I don't know, it feels incredibly relevant even today, even though that's like a thing that was I'm not sure when it came out, probably in the late 80s, maybe early 90s.
Early pioneer of relational aesthetics. Yeah.
So we wanted to open it up to questions to everybody in the audience. Does anyone have a question? Yeah. I can't bring this to you. Should I? Wait, can someone else pull
Yeah.
Thanks. I was just curious about the use of the word content, because being somewhat older than you, I come from a time when there was like there was a form content distinction that people tried to talk about, and so content seemed to imply certain things. And today there's this whole other thing of like the content creator as a kind of subservient part of a bigger system. And I'm just wondering how, since you all used content, how your use of it relates to those different ways of understanding content.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess when I say content collapse, I mean it in like the like a mixture of the two, right? It's like it has formal qualities to it, but it's mostly like a discursive like this thing. It's like content to me is both like pop cultural references that are like, or not references, pop cultural sort of like behemoths that are like large franchises and like intellectual properties, and it also wraps into itself the sort of like subservient content creator that you're talking about, which is sort of this like gig worker of the very contemporary moment in which like we are doing silly dances in front of a camera for like 2,000 views. Like that wraps itself into it too. So I guess maybe like there's like it depends on the context within which I'm saying it. But I guess I use it less in the sort of historical sense of like form versus content, and like that debate. But I guess I think there is something interesting there in that like those two things serving the same purpose in some way. Yeah.
I think of like every possible file format on a computer, and then alternatively from that, like everything from an Instagram post to a picture on DeviantArt to a tweet to like, and then when you start, like to me, content is like what happens when you think about the quantity of every single thing that has been put out on social media combined with every possible file format available. And then that's when I start, that's like the scope of content is that plus to me.
Yeah, I guess in like a vulgar Marxist sense, like a piece of content is just like a non-transferable system of value. So like the content is the thing that I create that has some sort of like capital that's only usable in a specific context. I guess like that. Some of it's useful. I mean, yeah, but yeah, it doesn't have an exchange value. It's something that like, yeah, and I think this is kind of a weird problem is because we've been stuck in this time where like content has not had a political dimension to it for a while, at least like in like neoliberalism through like massive defunding and like optimization towards like the market. There's like content has like ceased to have a dimension where it has any like real use value. I think there's a possibility that we've kind of like dwaddled around for long enough that like we accidentally created something that like can break reality as content, and like that's something that I'm kind of interested in. Yeah.
I think it has kind of started to take on like a political value, though. I think there's I think there's been not, and I think, everyone would want to point to like, Donald Trump in our election, but many elections like globally, like content has actually created like a very like viable use value in a sense.
Yeah,
and
totally.
And it also, I think it's has an advertising value too. Like there's advertisement that's like, I think at this point it's this very bizarre, it's a catch-all term because it is catching so much. Like it's desperately seeking to catch all of it.
Does anyone else have a question?
I'm sitting on the microphone.
I guess as a question for Harris specifically, I'm really fascinated with all the different material usages of petroleum, as you mentioned. But I was wondering if you could talk specifically about the squonk box and it as a kind of new outsider art tradition, and how that kind of filters into this other world building and kind of incorporating lore in these like different material exchanges.
Yeah, totally. So I guess with the squonk box and with some of the other pieces in the show, a squonk, just so everybody knows, a squonk mod is a type of vape that directly like deposits vape fluid onto the inductor coils. And so I think probably about a year ago, or I was looking in sort of like these depths of Reddit or whatever, and found these people who were making their own inductor coils and their own vape mods. And in it, I see this sort of like material determination of reality that is something that's reminiscent of craft, but that is like not something that would be understood as like ceramic. Like if I was to show a vape in like undergrad for like a sculpture crit, it would be like laughed at if I had like really spent all this time making these beautiful vape coils. So I guess now that I'm not an undergrad anymore, I have a little bit more of the freedom to like show these things as these craft communities for what they are. So with that piece in particular, a lot of it's trying to like make every component from scratch from the local materials of what that is. So like buying things on Amazon, like buying like nichrome wire, which is this like hyper refined like conflict mineral where you have like nickel and chrome turned into this like wire to make like jewelry or whatever, and then making my own inductors out of that and putting them in the mod, making my own battery packs, or making my own like latex bottle that like deposits the like fluid onto the coils. Like I guess what was interesting about these communities is that they're doing a thing that most fine artists aren't doing anymore, which is like determining the material world in like a real way, and taking the local material of contemporary life and doing that with it.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone else have something they want to ask?
Okay, I would love a little more conversation or discussion of the actual term, the virtual, and like what that means for each of you, because I think it's a term that we use kind of intentionally, vaguely, in these kind of conversations around contemporary art and the virtual. And like, I would love to just kind of also think about or hear your thoughts on its specific relationship to like materiality in a way that's not just like, I don't know, just talk about the virtual more, like the actual term and like what it is.
There's this talk that Cecil B. Evans gives, who's one of my favorite artists, in which she addresses the virtual, and I've sort of borrowed her definition in some ways, in which she like says the sentence like someone was virtually there, and that like isn't at all speaking about a digitalness. It's like saying that someone like was basically there, just like a facsimile of a person being there. And I think that's really like a sort of interesting place to think about it from, because it doesn't have to be sort of this digital thing, although that there's like a branding that has adapted it towards like a digitalness. So and I don't love any of the things that have branded it towards that particularly. And it is a sort of catch-all, easy thing to say when you're talking about something digital, and is intentionally vague, which is like why maybe I have such trouble with like separating the idea of a virtual and a physical, because like they just like by definition have nothing to do with one. Like virtual never described anything other than physicality. And then the material component of the virtual, I don't know. I think a lot about like having built computers for like 15 years. I think I've started to consider over the last couple of years like what like constitutes a GPU that like creates image for me, and like this like silicon that like goes into it. And I think Harris goes much more deeper into this, but I like materially like that becomes a sort of like the heat exchange between components and the way in which the components become cooled in order to like create image, to me feels very material, as well as like when I'm like sourcing assets from the internet becomes very material within the sort of guise of virtual. I get a lot of 3D scans from like 3D scan libraries, which are like virtual facsimiles of objects in the world in like a 3D space. Yeah.
I think a lot about Digimon when I think about the virtual, because I really, really liked that show as a kid, and I don't really remember much about it because I was really young. And I think a lot about there being, and again, someone out there I know probably actually really knows the lore of Digimon really well, and I'm about to completely destroy it, so I apologize, because I do not remember. I was very young, but what I remember of it is there being these digital monsters coming from this digital world, but that, from my perception of it as like a 5-year-old, was like just this magic world. And it was this magic fantasy world where these like beautiful creatures came out of to be your friend. And to me, like that was always kind of like what the virtual was. It was kind of this like dreamscape or dream world. And so my relationship to it, I think, is almost like a completely fake one, where I like have kind of just for myself bulldozed the internet and been like, the virtual to me is the world that I create like on my own computer. It's like the world that the Digimon come out of, and they come out of to like be my friend, and those are my sculptures. And I think that's kind of like what the virtual is personally to me. But as Almog mentioned, I'm in this show right now. Sort of, it's called, the title is really long, so thank you for remembering it. But it's called A Journey into the New Virtual, and it's a show, it's sort of about art and architecture being shaped like digitally, and the shows, a lot of it are sort of large like architecture firms that are working with like virtual reality and sort of virtual architecture. My part in the show is creating these kinds of like fantasy buildings in what like in programs I use that are like based on sort of grid technology. And so it's kind of, to me, in that definition, in their definition of the virtual, I think they were really thinking about like this very technical, like online computer-based virtual that's like based on a grid, created on a computer screen. But I actually really like the idea of virtual being kind of the almost reality. It's like the almost there. It's like, you know, if you've ever read The Golden Compass, it's like the other world that's just like a knife slice away, that's like right
Well,
next to us.
The dictionary definition of the word virtual is something that's nearly something, but not quite there.
Yeah, I mean, I think virtual effects, I always think of it in terms of virtual effects. And I guess the virtual is like the domain of like hyperstition or something, where like the idea of the technology or the reality has to exist before the reality can instantiate itself. So like you have like agrarian farming, somebody had to have the virtual proposition or like the virtual idea of like, man, we should stick around here and like plant the rice rather than just eating it right off the plant. And then that winds up kind of having this downstream effect of like actually creating the technology. It's sort of like this idea space or this almost there space that as reality gets more complicated, it kind of becomes something closer looking to magic. It also is something that doesn't operate on the same like physics of the real world. Like, I mean, yeah, you brought it up earlier, but this is like this constant example that people bring up of like the 4chaners that like brought Trump into like memehood or whatever. You have this like chaos that can exist in the virtual that just like doesn't make sense when it's instantiated into like a hegemonic physical world. And so it is still physical, it's still real, it's still causally effective, but it's like able to be a little bit more of like a demon or something, or an angel, hopefully. So, yeah.
Thank you all for coming out today, and thank you, Filip.
Thank you
Harris,
guys
and
so much.
Genevieve.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Also,
Thank you,
I really want to thank Almog. She did like so much work to prep for this, and she is in the middle of grad school finals right now. Do you know how stressful that is?
Seriously, yeah. Thank you,
Almog.
Almog. And thank you, Sarah, for hosting.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Stick around and hang out, I guess.